We need someone in the air now. The base commander's voice crackled through the operations center, sharp with urgency. Outside, warning sirens split the Arizona morning as dark smoke columns rose from the desert floor 30 miles out. A Marine convoy, 12 vehicles carrying 40 souls, pinned down by hostile fire with air support 20 minutes away. 20 minutes they didn't have. Captain Iris Donovan stood at the edge of the briefing room, unnoticed in the chaos. 34 years old, 5,000 hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, and invisible to the scrambling officers who kept searching for someone more expected. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Warthog was built ugly and underestimated, too. That's what made it lethal. Sir. Her voice cut through the noise, steady and low. Colonel Brennan's eyes swept past her, then returned with visible reluctance. Captain Donovan, we need pilots. I'm qualified on the A-10. I can be wheels up in 4 minutes. The silence that followed carried the weight of a dozen unspoken objections. Donovan had heard them all before. Too cautious. Too methodical. Too quiet for the swagger expected of a close air support pilot. 3 months ago, she'd been reassigned from flight status to operations planning after an incident report called her risk-averse, following a mission abort when her hydraulics showed amber warnings. The system had been fine. She'd been wrong to turn back. Or so they'd told her. Flashback, 18 months earlier. Night training run over Nevada ranges. Donovan threading her A-10 through simulated surface-to-air missile environments, while younger pilots pushed harder, flew bolder. Her instructors had noted her excessive caution even as she posted perfect scores on target acquisition and weapons delivery. You fly like you're afraid of the aircraft, one had said. She'd wanted to explain that respect wasn't fear, that understanding the machine's limits was how you survived to become excellent. But pilots weren't supposed to respect limits. They were supposed to exceed them. Captain, with respect, you haven't logged flight hours in 3 months. Brennan's voice carried the measured patience of authority explaining reality to someone who didn't understand their place. We need combat-ready pilots, and frankly, your record suggests 40 Marines dying in the desert while we debate my record. Donovan held his gaze, her voice never rising. Sir, the radio crackled again. Base, this is Raptor 1-1. We're taking casualties, multiple wounded. We need air support immediately. Brennan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was already reaching for solutions that didn't exist. The ready pilots were airborne on a training evolution 200 miles north. The quick reaction force was down for maintenance. Every other qualified Warthog driver was either deployed or grounded. Get to your aircraft, Brennan said finally. The words forced through evident reluctance. Call sign Hammer 2-1. You abort at the first sign of trouble. Understood? This isn't the time for proving anything. Donovan was already moving toward the door. Not proving anything, sir. Just doing my job. The flight line stretched before her, shimmering in the 100-degree heat that made the runway asphalt soft and treacherous. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Yuki Nakamura, stood beside aircraft 810981, a veteran A-10 with nose art depicting a warthog wearing a crown. Nakamura's expression shifted through surprise to something harder to read as Donovan approached. Captain. Nakamura's greeting carried a question. Didn't expect to see you in flight gear today. Makes 2 of us. Donovan ran through her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency, her hands moving over the aircraft with the familiarity of a pianist at a keyboard. The A-10 was a symphony of brutal simplicity, a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon built into an airplane rather than the other way around. Ugly, slow, and absolutely devastating in the right hands. Hydraulics are good, Nakamura reported, following Donovan around the aircraft. All systems green. Fresh load of 30mm, full complement of Mavericks. She paused. Captain, about last time? Not now, Nakamura. Donovan checked the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit, the armor that made the A-10 the most survivable close air support platform ever built. Survivable for pilots who trusted it, who didn't abort at the first warning light. She climbed into the cockpit, the familiar embrace of straps and switches settling around her like coming home after too long away. Her fingers moved through startup procedures with muscle memory precision. Engines spooling up, the distinctive growl of the twin turbofans rising to a roar, hydraulic pressure building, flight controls responding. And there, just for a moment, the hydraulic pressure gauge flickered. Donovan's hand froze on the throttle. Amber light, barely a flash, then green again. System nominal. Probably nothing. Definitely nothing worth scrubbing over when Marines were dying. The voice in her head, the same one that had cost her 3 months of flight status, whispered warnings. Check it again. Run the auxiliary. Better to delay than to trust a system that might fail at the worst possible moment. She pushed the thought down and keyed the radio. Tower. Hammer 2-1 ready for immediate departure. Hammer 2-1, you're cleared for emergency takeoff runway 27. Winds 270 at 12, gusting to 18. Raptor 1-1 is 40 miles southeast. Coordinates to follow. They're in trouble. Donovan released brakes and pushed throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated with its characteristic lack of grace, a flying gun that handled like a cement mixer and hit like the wrath of God. 60 knots. 80. The heat shimmer made the runway ahead waver like a mirage. 100 knots. She pulled back on the stick and the Warthog lifted reluctantly into the sky, climbing over the base perimeter fence with all the elegance of a garbage truck taking flight. But airborne. That was all that mattered. Hammer 2-1 airborne, heading A-90. She banked southeast, her eyes already scanning the desert floor ahead. The terrain rushed beneath her wings at 300 knots, slow by fighter standards, but for the A-10, speed was never the point. The point was arriving with enough ordnance to turn enemy positions into memories and enough armor to survive the process. The coordinates placed Raptor convoy in a canyon system 38 miles out. Donovan pulled up the tactical display, overlaying topographical data with the last known enemy positions. Textbook ambush site high ground on both sides, limited escape routes, perfect fields of fire for whoever held the ridgelines. Raptor 1-1, this is Hammer 2-1 inbound your position, ETA 12 minutes. What's your situation? Static hissed and popped, then a voice, tight with controlled terror. Hammer 2-1. We're pinned in a canyon taking fire from both ridges. We've got 3 vehicles disabled, multiple wounded. We can't maneuver. We need immediate suppression of enemy positions grid. The transmission dissolved into the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire. 12 minutes. The thought beat against her skull like a hammer. Every second counted when people were bleeding. The hydraulic pressure gauge flickered again. Amber for 2 seconds, then green. Still within parameters, still technically functional, but that flutter of uncertainty scraped against her instincts, like fingernails on metal. Flashback, 3 months ago. Night mission. Similar amber light. Her decision to abort. Landing to find the system reading perfect. Maintenance unable to replicate the fault. The incident report calling it excessive caution bordering on risk aversion. The whispered conversations in ready rooms about pilots who couldn't trust their aircraft. Couldn't make the calls when it mattered. Trust the machine or trust your gut. Sometimes the choice was which voice to listen to. Donovan pushed the throttles forward, coaxing another 10 knots from engines already screaming. The desert blurred beneath her, rock formations and dry riverbeds painting abstract patterns in tan and brown. Beautiful and lethal, like everything that flew. Raptor 1-1, I'm 8 minutes out. Can you mark your position with smoke? Negative, we're too exposed. Enemy positions are another burst of fire, louder now. Both ridges, estimate 24 fighters with heavy weapons. Hammer, we've got wounded who won't survive medevac timeline. We need you now. 7 minutes. Donovan studied her approach vector, running calculations that were part mathematics and part prayer. Standard doctrine called for identifying targets before engagement, coordinating with ground forces, methodical elimination of threats starting from greatest to least. Standard doctrine took time. The hydraulic gauge flickered once more. This time it stayed amber for 3 seconds. A warning chime sounded in her headset, soft but insistent. Auxiliary hydraulic system activated automatically, maintaining pressure to flight controls. The backup was solid. Triple redundancy was what made the A-10 nearly unkillable. But amber lights weren't supposed to happen. Systems were supposed to work or fail. Not whisper maybes. Hammer 2-1. Say status. The tower's voice carried an edge of concern. Donovan made the calculation in heartbeats. Primary hydraulics still functional, auxiliary compensating, all flight controls responsive. The amber light could mean a sensor fault, a minor leak, or the leading edge of catastrophic failure. If she turned back now, the Marines would die. If she continued and the system failed at low altitude during a gun run, she would die. Trust your training or trust your instincts. Sometimes they pointed in opposite directions. Hammer 2-1 status is green, continuing to target. The words tasted like copper, the flavor of Lee's, told for good reasons. 5 minutes out, the canyon system came into view. Smoke rose from multiple points, dark against the pale sky. She could see the Marine vehicles now, clustered in the narrow canyon floor like toys abandoned in a sandbox. Movement on the ridgelines, enemy fighters repositioning, targeting the vulnerable convoy below. Raptor 1-1, Hammer 2-1 visual on your position. I'm coming in from the north. We'll make a gun run on the eastern ridge first. Keep your heads down. Copy that, Hammer. Eastern ridge is where they're concentrated. God, we're glad to hear you. Donovan banked into her approach vector, dropping to 2,000 feet above ground level. The A-10 shuddered slightly as she pushed into the dive, the armored bathtub around her cockpit suddenly feeling very small. Through her canopy, she could see the ridgeline resolving into individual rocks, scrub brush, and the tiny figures of fighters with weapons raised. The hydraulic pressure fluctuated again. This time, the amber stayed, accompanied by a second warning chime. The flight stick felt slightly mushy, the precise control she'd always trusted degrading into something loose and uncertain. Auxiliary system compensating, but primary definitely failing now. She should abort, pull up, return to base, let them scramble another aircraft. That was the textbook call, the safe call, the call that would keep her alive and prove her critics right, the captain who couldn't be trusted when it mattered, the pilot who valued her own survival over the mission. The faces in those Marine vehicles weren't textbook. They were 19-year-olds from Iowa and 40-year-old sergeants from Texas, people with families and futures, and every reason to see tomorrow. Donovan centered her pipper on the eastern ridgeline and squeezed the trigger. The Gawain Avenger roared to life with a sound like God tearing canvas. 4,000 rounds per minute, each 30mm shell the size of a milk bottle. Depleted uranium penetrators designed to kill tanks, reducing the ridgeline to a horizontal tornado of pulverized rock and shredded earth. The A-10 shuddered from the recoil. The gun produced so much backward thrust that firing could actually slow the aircraft in flight. Enemy positions vanished in clouds of dust and fragmentation. Donovan walked the fire along the ridge, methodical and precise despite the wounded hydraulics, her eyes tracking secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off. 3 seconds. 5. 7 seconds of sustained fire, nearly 500 rounds downrange. She pulled up hard and banked left, the stick fighting her now as hydraulic pressure continued dropping. Yellow lights multiplied across her instrument panel like malignant stars. The aircraft responded, but sluggishly, warning her that forgiveness was running out. Hammer 2-1, you're beautiful. Eastern ridge is neutralized. We can see weight. Western ridge is lighting up. They're repositioning to... The warning tone in Donovan's headset rose to a scream. Primary hydraulic system failure. Amber turned to red across her board. Auxiliary system working, but fighting alone now to keep the aircraft controllable. She had maybe one more gun run before the backup failed too. Or she could climb out, make it back to base, save the aircraft and herself. The Marines would die, but that wasn't her fault. She'd done what she could. Flashback, 12 years ago. Flight school. An instructor with 30 years and 1,000 stories leaning against a T-38 in the Texas heat. Donovan, he'd said, you've got the hands of a surgeon and the brain of an engineer. You'll be a good pilot. Maybe even a great one. But to be a great one, you'll need to learn when to stop thinking and start trusting. She'd nodded, not understanding. He'd smiled, sad somehow. You'll figure it out. Usually happens when you don't have a choice. Donovan threw the A-10 into a hard right bank, diving toward the western ridgeline. The stick felt like steering through mud, the aircraft's responses delayed and uncertain. She compensated with throttle and rudder, flying partially on instruments and partially on feel developed through 5,000 hours of becoming one with the machine. The western ridge rushed up to meet her, faster than it should have because she was lower than she should be, committed to an angle of attack that left no room for mistakes. Through the dust and smoke she could see muzzle flashes, fighters emerging from cover to engage the wounded convoy below. She centered her pipper and fired. The Go-8's roar filled the universe. The hydraulic pressure gauge went black, not amber, not red, just dark as the auxiliary system gave up its fight. The flight stick went limp in her hand, sudden and terrifying, the aircraft's control surfaces freezing in whatever position they'd been when the system died. The A-10 was no longer an aircraft. It was 10 tons of metal and ordnance in ballistic flight, a bullet that happened to have wings. Time contracted to crystalline clarity. Donovan's hands moved through emergency procedures burned into muscle memory manual reversion. Throttle control for basic pitch and yaw. Opposite engine thrust for crude turning. The terrain filled her canopy, rock and sky trading places, as the aircraft tumbled through space without grace or control. The ejection seat was right there. One pull on the handles and she'd be out. Parachute deploying. Survival certain if painful. Let the aircraft crater into the desert floor. Insurance would cover it. She'd be alive. But the gun was still firing, still chewing through the western ridgeline, still suppressing the enemy positions that were killing the Marines below. If she ejected now, that would stop. The aircraft would spin into the canyon wall, the mission would fail, and people would die. Donovan pulled throttles to idle on the right engine and full on the left. The asymmetric thrust rolled the aircraft, crude and violent but effective. She timed it by instinct rather than instruments, feeling the motion through the seat of her pants and the hip forces pressing against her chest. One roll. Two. The horizon appeared where it should be. Briefly. She watched the desert floor through the canopy, rushing up with mathematical inevitability. 500 feet. 400. The altimeter was unwinding like a slot machine paying out in reverse. She modulated throttles, trying to arrest the descent through engine power alone since she had no other control. 300 feet. The western ridgeline disappeared behind her. She glimpsed Marine vehicles scrambling to move, fighters retreating from the suppressed positions. 200 feet. The manual reversion system, her last desperate hope, had given her nothing. The flight controls were dead weight. She was flying a 35-foot titanium brick with engines. 100 feet. She could see individual rocks now. The texture of sand, a lizard frozen on a boulder staring up at what must have seemed like an apocalypse descending. Donovan cut power to both engines and pulled back on the dead stick with both hands. Pointless and instinctive. The nose came up fractionally, maybe from the thrust change, maybe from prayers being answered, maybe from nothing at all. The A-10 hit the desert floor on its belly, engines scraping earth, weapons pylons disintegrating in showers of sparks. The titanium bathtub around her cockpit did exactly what it was designed to do, protecting her through an impact that should have been lethal. The aircraft skidded across sand and rock, shedding parts and velocity in equal measure. Something exploded behind her, probably a fuel tank, turning the crash into a rolling fireball. But she was in the armored bathtub, the safest place on any battlefield, and the fire was outside. The world stopped moving. Donovan hung in her harness, ears ringing from impact, vision swimming from gephyresses that had compressed her spine and emptied her lungs. The instrument panel was dark, powered by batteries that had died or disconnected. Through the cracked canopy she could see smoke and twisted metal, the wreckage of what had been a perfect aircraft 12 minutes ago. She was alive. That seemed impossible, but was nevertheless true. The radio in her helmet crackled, running on backup power. Hammer 2-1, say status. Hammer 2-1, do you copy? Donovan tried to speak and coughed instead, her lungs remembering how to function. She unstrapped with shaking hands, popped the emergency canopy release, and climbed out onto the wing. Her legs buckled when they touched ground, and she sat down hard, staring at the smoking ruin of her aircraft. 300 yards away, Marine vehicles were moving out of the canyon, engines roaring, dust rising behind them as they accelerated toward open ground. All 12 vehicles, all 40 Marines. Hammer 2-1. She had to stop and breathe, her voice ragged. I'm okay. Aircraft is no longer mission capable. Raptor 1-1, confirm your status. The reply came through static, and something that might have been tears. Hammer, we're mobile, we're clear, all personnel accounted for. Jesus, you just saved 40 lives. Donovan looked at the wreckage of her A-10, already burning itself out in the desert sun. The critics had been right. She was risk-averse, cautious, unable to trust the aircraft when systems started failing. They'd been right about everything except what mattered. Because when she'd had to choose between safety and mission, between herself and others, between the voices that said turn back and the voices that said continue, she'd chosen correctly. The rescue helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, medics checking her for injuries she didn't have while pilots stared at the crash site with professional horror and involuntary respect. You walked away from that. The unspoken words hung in the air like heat shimmer. Captain Donovan. A voice from behind her transmitted through the crowd of rescuers. Colonel Brennan climbed out of a command vehicle, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. Here it came. The formal inquiry, the accident investigation, the end of her career written in regulations and protocol. She'd destroyed a $30 million aircraft because she'd pushed through system warnings she should have heeded. That the mission succeeded was irrelevant to the paperwork. Brennan stopped 3 feet away and did something Donovan had never seen him do before. He saluted. Not the casual greeting of peers, but the full formal acknowledgement reserved for heroes and honored dead. Captain, on behalf of the 40 Marines you saved today, I apologize for doubting you, for grounding you, for every time I questioned whether you had what it takes. His voice carried across the desert, audible to everyone present. You had it. You always had it. We were just too blind to see. The other pilots took up the salute, one by one, until Donovan was surrounded by raised hands and sudden tears she couldn't control. She returned the salute, her hands shaking, her throat too tight for words. The hydraulic failure, Brennan continued. Maintenance found the fault in your aircraft from 3 months ago. Sensor malfunction causing intermittent false readings. You were right to abort then. And right to continue today. That's not luck, Captain. That's judgment. The words landed like bombs, destroying the narrative she'd carried for 3 months. She hadn't been wrong. The system had been compromised. Her instincts correct. Her caution the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. You're reinstated to full flight status effective immediately, Brennan said, pending your medical clearance and completion of the accident investigation, which, for the record, will show that you made every correct decision under circumstances that would have killed a less skilled pilot. 3 weeks later, Donovan stood in front of the base's assembled personnel as Brennan pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her uniform. The citation read like something from another pilot's career. Exceptional heroism, complete disregard for personal safety, direct action resulting in 40 lives saved. They'd found her A-10's flight data recorder in the wreckage. The investigation board had watched in silent awe as the telemetry showed her flying a dead aircraft through ballistic entry, using only engine thrust to prevent tumbling into the canyon wall. I've never seen anyone fly like that, the board chairman had said. I didn't think it was possible. But more than the medal, more than the reinstatement, Donovan treasured the letter that arrived from Raptor 1-1. Staff Sergeant Michael Ruiz, 42 years old, 3 deployments, a wife and 2 daughters in California. My youngest turned 7 last week. He'd written in cramped handwriting. She asked me to thank the pilot who made sure I came home. So thank you, Captain, for not giving up, for trusting yourself when everyone else doubted, for being exactly who we needed when it mattered most. Donovan kept that letter in her flight suit pocket. She was wearing it 6 months later when Brennan offered her command of the base's A-10 training squadron. We need pilots who understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, he'd said. It's knowing when to listen to that fear and when to fly through it anyway. That's what you teach them. She accepted. Not because she needed vindication that had come the day she'd climbed out of the wreckage alive. Not because she wanted recognition the medal was already in a drawer somewhere. She accepted because 40 people were alive who wouldn't have been, and because the next generation of pilots needed someone who understood that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing it anyway. 2 years after that flight, the base dedicated a new ready room. Above the entrance, a placard bore an image of an A-10 in simple words: Captain Iris Donovan Memorial Training Facility. Not memorial because she died, she was standing right there at the dedication, alive and commanding. Memorial because the pilot who'd climbed into that cockpit questioning her every instinct had died in the desert. The one who'd walked away knew better. She addressed the assembled pilots, her words carrying the weight of experience earned in moments measured in seconds. "They're going to tell you to trust your aircraft," she said. "They're going to tell you to trust your training. And they're right, you should. But there will come a time when the systems are failing, and the training doesn't have an answer, and you're alone in the cockpit with only your judgment between success and catastrophe." She paused, looking at the young faces, seeing herself years ago before she'd learned what courage actually meant. In that moment, trust yourself. Because you weren't born knowing how to fly. You learned through thousands of hours and hundreds of mistakes, and the accumulated wisdom of every pilot who came before you. That wisdom is in you. Honor it by listening when it speaks. The pilots dispersed to their aircraft, to their futures, to their own moments of truth waiting somewhere in the sky. Donovan watched them go, then turned to the A-10 waiting on the tarmac. Not hers, she flew a desk now most days. But she still took one up every week, keeping her skills sharp, staying current. Because 40 Marines were alive and raising families and living futures that might not have existed. Because somewhere, another pilot would face an impossible choice and need to know that someone had already made it. Because the sky always needed pilots who understood that the bravest thing you can do is admit you're afraid and fly anyway. She climbed into the cockpit, ran through pre-flight checks, and released brakes. The familiar roar of engines, the acceleration down the runway, the moment of transition from earth to sky, the hydraulic gauge red-green, all systems nominal. But if they flickered amber, she'd know what to do. Trust the training. Trust the aircraft. Trust herself. In that order. Or sometimes, when lives hung in the balance, in whatever order the situation demanded. That was what they didn't teach in flight school. That was what you learned when the choices were impossible and you made them anyway. The A-10 lifted into the desert sky, graceless and brutal and beautiful, carrying a pilot who'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes the first step to proving exactly how wrong everyone had been. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.